you. It's amazing to see what you guys have managed to achieve pulling this together, and my hat really goes off to all Joel and the rest of the crew. Thank you all very much. Joel gave me the title of The First Cut is the Deepest, which I tried to do something with, so bear with me. As Marietta kindly said, I'm an emergency physician and a retrieval specialist, and I do spend a lot of time teaching, which is my sort of third passion. So what I'm hoping to give you today is what I do, how I got there, because I'm hoping that there's some things that you guys can take away, and how what I did before I got here, how it really helped me in terms of pushing forward our developments in disaster medicine in Sydney in particular. So if you'll bear with the journey, I'll show you why we got there in the end and why we continue to push forward. So this is my life at the moment. It's a little bit chaotic. It's my daughter who's up the back who got dragged along, and she's got dragged along to many things in her lifetime, will attest to. It's a combination of doing and teaching, spent lots of time teaching, and a typical sort of fortnight might look like this. I'll do some retrieval shifts, both on sort of fixed wings and helicopters and road ambulances. I'll do some teaching, things like the Mobile Simulation Centre, which is where I was in the weekend. And we do lots of sort of try to do some sort of fairly high fidelity kind of simulation to try and train as we fight. And of course, I try and be home every so often to see my poor kids. This is where I work. It's the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital Emergency Department, and I think I've seen some of the medical students who are going through their training at RPA, and it's great to see you there. So, who here has decided? It's very bright in here, but who here has decided what they're going to do when they grow up? Any ideas? No, show of hands. Good, excellent. That's exactly the response that I wanted. Not many, which is great. Keep your options open. So when you're trying to look for what you're going to do with your life at the end of medical school, please ask yourself why. So my dad was a very, very smart man. He was years ahead of his life. I'm the only medic in my family ever. And he sort of said, well, okay, if you want to do this crazy thing, what I want you to do is ask yourself why. And I want you to talk to people who are actually doing the job to make sure that you want the job that's at the end of the training program, not what you think it is. And I think that was a really, really wise thing to do. And I did go in with my eyes open, which is great. So please do start here. And why did I do emergency medicine? Well, it's actually not too far off this. It's we're up here somewhere. Yep. So I'm sure you guys would have all seen this. This is the career path for all people in medicine. You guys all seen this? Yeah. Cool. All right, so medicine people, emergency medicine folk, yeah, we are a bit nuts. We have a very short attention span, and so therefore we all go into emergency medicine because no one else will put up with us. So, fair enough? All right. So, but why do I really love doing it? Well, I do love it. I love it particularly because it gives me lots of options, but sort of even going further back, I love it because I could never decide which one of the things that I knew how to do that I didn't want to not do anymore. So I still want to be able to treat a neonate. I still want to be able to resuscitate a child. I still want to know what to do with a STEMI. I still want to know with that lacerated tendon, what to do with that lacerated tendon. I still want to know how to do all those things because in my head, that's what a real doctor does. So that's why I think emergency physicians are still real doctors, and I like that. We do have a short attention span. After 6 hours, my off button goes, if you're not in the ward by then I'm not all that interested, if I'm honest. For those people who have other priorities in their life, the great thing about emergency medicine is it's sessional. So which means that you do your job and then you go home. We don't have patients to look after hours. We're not on call for weeks on end. We don't have to do the 24-hour call after we go home at the end of our shift, which is really, really great. And particularly for the women in the audience, if you want to have children, it's a really great specialty for that because you can drop back to part-time and do that. And for guys, if they want to take time out to look after their kids, it's very easy to do that as well. So it's a really great specialty for those of us who want to have other things in their life. And if you meet most emergency physicians, we're people who like doing other things. Lots of options. So as you saw what my typical fortnight looks like, there are lots of things you can do with ED because we have the whole gamut of skills from the major resuscitation skills, airway, breathing, circulation, to the more minor skills that allows us to work on oil rigs and general practice and all those sorts of things, which is really great. Now that's not to say we replace GPs because we're not good at that. We'll put that out there. I don't think it's a specialty because we tend to be, like I said, a short attention span. But it means that we can do some minor general practice stuff. But you do need some life experience. And I just had an interesting chat with Marietta on the way through. She said, well, if you finished your training 22 years ago and you've been an emergency physician for 10 years, what the heck did you do the rest of the time? Good question. Well, lots of it. So I started emergency medicine, and then I realised that actually I was going to end up as a cynical cow if I kept going along straight on the pathway. So I did lots of other things, and I'll talk about that in a minute, and none of it has been wasted, and all of it has allowed me to do what I do now. But you need some life experience, and you can't be that guy, all right? No white coats. So who here, another question for you guys, who here has got an idea that you need to finish your med school, do your intern year, do your resident year, do your primary, then get into a specialty training program, and then 4 or 5 years later you'll be spat out the other end? Who thinks that's a good thing to do? Great. Excellent. So do not do that, okay? There are other things that you can do with your life, and the problem with doing that is that you end up at the tender age of your early 30s, then wondering what the hell else you're going to do, because consultant jobs are limited. You're going to be doing that job for a very long time. So consider doing other things along the way. That is very much the boring route. So how did I get to emergency medicine? Like this. Definitely not the other way. So if I started as a med student, we'll start up here and work down. Started as a med student, again, finished 22 years ago. I did my first year as an intern and was a complete paper pusher. And I remember my dad ringing me going, "Oh, you're loving saving lives?" Thought the only thing here is I'm saving trees. In fact, I'm not doing that because I'm destroying millions of them by writing copious stupid notes and referrals. So that's what the first year is all about. Then I did my resident year, decided that I couldn't really put up with all the egos in the hospital and thinking, why am I doing this? Still paper pushing. So in my third year, I decided to do an SRMO job and do lots of different things. So I did cardiothoracics and ENT and all sorts of relief kind of stuff while I did a sports med diploma, because it got me outside doing something outside the hospital. And actually that set me up for what I do now. Then I came over to Sydney and I did a junior registrar job here, and I worked nights over Christmas coming from little old New Zealand where the only thing we see is alcohol and a bit of marijuana, and every single patient I saw was on something that involved some form of amphetamine or worse. So and I was thinking, what the hell is this place? But it was a good introduction to emergency medicine. Then I decided I was going to go travelling and then go back to doing sports med in New Zealand when I got a great job back there. So we moved back over the Tasman for 18 months. While I was trying to figure out, there was a relief position for 12 months. I learned an enormous amount, and I learned the thing I really like doing is being outside and working as part of a team. That's what I really like doing. But I didn't like the office component of sports medicine, so that put kind of GP work and that sort of stuff out the window. I did a bit of GP for 9 months, and I have the utmost respect for GPs because it's the hardest and worst job I've ever done in my entire life, and I sucked at it. So it was a really good learning experience, and I have learnt respect first and foremost for that. Came back to Australia, did lots of ED locums all over the place, which now has stood me in great stead because I go off with the Hetty mobile simulation bus to crazy places like Lightning Ridge and Coonabarabran, and I've worked in lots of those places, so I know the challenges of having a sick patient when you've got no backup and you're very junior and you don't know what you're doing. So it's a good experience to have had. Started my ED training when I rang my boss 2 years later after I left the first time saying, can I have my job back? And she said, actually, I told you so, and you start on Monday, you idiot. So I came back, started my ED training, and have been at RPA ever since. In the middle of that, I had my daughter, and then have sat my face some exams, and I did my CareFlight registrar term the year before I finished. Fell in love with retrieval medicine because it brought all the stuff about teams, and it brought all the stuff about being part of a team working outside, but brought the critical care stuff all together. So again, it's all fed into the same stuff. And then as things have sort of gone on, I've basically said yes to everything, and it's been a really fun journey since then. All right, so my first message to you guys is no experience is wasted. Get out there, get some life experience, go do some stuff. If people offer you opportunities, take it with both hands, because you never know what those experiences will lead you to and how useful they will be in the future, because they probably will be. That doesn't mean you don't have a plan, and please don't confuse the two. I always had a plan, but I chose to take the opportunities when they presented themselves if it looked like they were going to get me further along the plan, albeit maybe a more circuitous route. So what would I tell my medical student self? All these things. Enjoy the journey. Say yes to everything. No experience is ever wasted because it will make you a better doctor. And if you think about it, medicine is just pattern recognition. You just need to have seen enough patterns. And one of the things I'm noticing in my emergency physician colleagues coming through, and you notice it particularly from the US when they go through really, really hothouse in a very short space of time, sometimes you just haven't quite seen enough stuff. And that's where just taking a little bit longer and doing other things can stand you into good stead. So go and do that MSF deployment. Go do the things you want to do. Be prepared to take a left turn. It's definitely tough, but it's definitely worth it, and stick with it. So if you choose a job you love, you'll never work in the day of your life, and it does feel like that. There are good days and bad days, but I love what I do. But I think that's kind of almost a little bit facile, so I think this is probably a better mantra to have. Oprah Winfrey is a pretty cool lady, and I think these two things are also kind of rules to live by. But particularly the last one, do what you have to do. And there's a whole bunch of service component to our jobs, let's face it. Still in mine, definitely in yours and yours to come, there's a whole bunch of service component. But don't lose sight of the end of the tunnel because it's very bright when you get there. So, moving on to disaster stuff. How did I get there? You think, well, I've done all these things, and how did we get to have a passion for disaster medicine? Well, this is how. So in 2009, I got a phone call from my boss, now my colleague, who said, look, we've just been asked by the Australian Defence Force to do all the pre-deployment training for all the doctors, nurses, medics, and what we call combat first aiders deploying to Afghanistan for the next 5 years. Can we do it? And the answer, of course, is yes, absolutely. Take it and run with it. So we had the best 4 years, and then it sort of tailored off over the last year as the war in Afghanistan as our involvement, should I say, decreased. But this would involve doing some very, very high-level simulation training, and it basically meant taking some junior doctors in particular, so RMO2s, RMO3s, and making them into senior ED registrars in 2 weeks, which is no mean feat. And we did some very high-fidelity simulation working with another company who did all the moulage and the battle effects. It was a sensational educational experience, but we did lots of mass casualty stuff as a part of that. So I've seen what this looks like when it goes well and how the ingredients that make this stuff go well. And so having been through the Lindt Cafe Siege, which I'll talk about in a moment, this is what spurred me on, going, I've seen this work well, this so didn't, and so how do we bridge the gap? The other thing that sort of helped me in the disaster preparation was I spent a year back in Auckland in 2012. And Auckland's a funny place because I grew up there, so I can say this. Left hand definitely didn't talk to right hand. So you've got a big harbour there, limited resources, lots of volunteer ambulances, and the civil defence didn't talk to the police, didn't talk to the fireys, didn't talk to the ambulance, because that would be just, that's turf wars. We're not going to do that. So we conducted some training exercises where we brought people together to do some training together, and it really showed us that that's the key thing, is to get left hand to talk to right hand and realise that left hand actually isn't quite as bad as we thought left hand might be, and right hand's not quite as bad as we thought right hand might be, and actually, yeah, you know what? It actually does work much better when we all are on the same page. So that was the next most influential thing. So my husband is away on a boys' weekend, or boys' couple of weeks, and I had my parents-in-law staying, and I was at work during the day, and my parents-in-law had my son, who at that stage was 3, and they were going to go and see the Christmas tree in Martin Place, and about 10:15, my colleague comes through the ED and grabs me by the shoulder and goes, oh, I think we might be busy. There's some hostages in the Lindt Cafe in Martin Place. So, of course, my first thought was, oh, expletive, my parents-in-law have my son and they're going there. So obviously that was my first thing. And then, once I'd made sure that was okay, then we realised that, yeah, we are going to be busy, because we, at our PA, are the major referral hospital for any of this kind of stuff. And probably the most confronting thing I saw was that, I still remember it very clearly, I couldn't find a photo of it, but the media footage of the Lindt Cafe window with all those people there, but then all the emergency services almost lined up almost in front of it, and just thinking, holy smoke, at this, if this goes pear-shaped, we're going to have truckloads of casualties, and a lot of them are going to be emergency services workers. So again, from all the background I've just shown you, things kind of kicked into gear. But it was interesting because my vision of how this should work, i.e. our ability to escalate and get prepared, because if the needful happened, it was going to happen very, very quickly, didn't happen. And I was thinking, why? So we weren't allowed to escalate, we weren't allowed to get any more prepared because no information was flowing. And after having dissected this over the last couple of years, that was the key bit. There was no information from the scene. Obviously, the police aren't going to give us any information because it's still potentially a terrorist incident. So there was this lack of flow and effect. And then the New South Wales Health Plan can't be activated unless you have a certain amount of information from the scene, the emergency services at the scene. And of course, none of those things were happening for, if you look back, obvious reasons. So the system is broken. Our readiness has had to increase. So 2015, we had a tactical police briefing. They said it's not if, it's when. And obviously that, our level of alertness has had to go up and up and up since then, particularly with the events overseas and in Melbourne in within the last 6 months with the Ariana Grande concert in Manchester, where 59 casualties were taken to different hospitals. The London Bridge incident, there have been 2 incidences in Melbourne, but one in particular where the car ran up it knocked over about 12 people. About 20 people, one person dead. And now even in Martin Place, you'll see they've put those barriers up there. So the tempo is escalating and best we be ready. So now is the time. It's not, again, to wait till something happens and everyone goes, oh, well, in the end it wasn't that bad because we only had 5 casualties. It was fine. We don't have to change much. Now is the time to start really shaking the chain and going, you know what, the first time didn't work very well, so let's make those changes. And there are some changes afoot, but it is my personal opinion, and it's my opinion only, that we're not anywhere near where we need to be. So we need to start asking this, what if? And I'm just going to take you through a simulated disaster scenario just to give you a taste of what things really might look at. And everything I've got in here is based on events overseas. So Paris, Boston, Orlando, and when the information starts trickling through a bit more clearly, I will add in information from London and from Manchester. So bear with me. So we live in this beautiful city. There are, in the latest census, there are 4.95 million people, and 34% of those are from overseas. We have about 32 million tourists every single year, so that's quite a lot, isn't it? Thinking about our transport, we have 26,000 people riding on our rail networks per hour. There are 4,000 people going through Town Hall Station per hour in peak hour. Bus ridership. As you can see there, 232 million, so 650,000 people travel in Sydney on a bus per day, per 24-hour period. And there are 14.8 million passengers per year on the ferries. So there are a lot of people moving around our city. We've got lots of really cool events. Vivid's just been, Mardi Gras been earlier in the year. There's all sorts of festivals. People gather on the foreshores of Sydney for amazing events like the fireworks. So we're a busy city and we have lots of people moving around in public places a lot of the time. The Opera House has lots of concerts. And so these are the things that we need to be aware of, not scared, aware. And these are the things that we need to plan in terms of numbers of people. So kind of like this one. And this is a simulated event. Bear with me. So, the Insane concert, 6,000 people in the forecourt of the Opera House, and that is actually how many people the forecourt of the Opera House holds. You guys are all sitting there, you know, you're enjoying a glass of wine, watching the opening thing on TV, and then you see this. There, can I have some sound, please? There. So on this video here, you'll hear, if the sound was up, you'd hear some gunfire and some screaming and an explosion. Could this happen? Absolutely, it could happen. All right, so you check your news feed. ABC News comes across your phone. Suicide and shooting, a suicide bomber and shootings at the Insane concert. Hundreds are wounded. Now you're on duty at your hospital, which is one of the inner city hospitals. So Vinnie's, PA St George in particular, North Shore. They're the ones that are within a 10k radius of the Sydney Opera House. You get news that hundreds are wounded. We don't know any more information than that at the scene. Who here is a little bit terrified? Or would be? Yeah, absolutely. All right, we don't know much more than that, but the problem with the Opera House is this, and this is where we need to start really thinking what if on each of these locations. The problem with the Opera House is it's one road in, one road out. Here's the Opera House, okay? And that's why they've again put those barriers up so that people can't ram raid up here. There's basically one road in and one road out. So getting people in and out of an event like that is going to be a nightmare. But events overseas have shown that people don't just arrive by ambulance. People arrive very early by public transport, by cars, by emergency services vehicles that have just picked them up and run with them, by any way possible, calling an Uber. That any of those things will work. Then they're going to get there much, much quicker than we think. So you're on duty wherever you are placed with your attachment. What are you going to do? What now? What would you do? Yeah, exactly. You go, holy, I hope someone's got a plan, right? Yeah, good, right. Okay, what are you going to expect? Well, if we're going to plan for things like these kind of incidents, we need to know what injuries to expect. And obviously, we're quite good at treating these injuries in a military setting now because they do them all the time. And the emphasis on how to treat these injuries has changed quite significantly, with tourniquets being really, really important in this management, and the concept of damage control surgery, again, enormously important, but not something that we do every day unless you're a military surgeon. So, more on that later. So, thinking about blast, how close you are to the blast dictates your pattern of injury. So, if you're really close to the blast, then chances are you're going to be dead. There's usually a pressure wave which will impact the body, and you may be thrown, or usually people within that very close proximity are just dead. And the interesting thing I learnt recently from one of the hazmat guys is that blast wave can actually travel. So if you've got a wind tunnel through some skyscrapers, you might get casualties from 2 different locations because that blast wave has actually followed the wind tunnel and actually done its thing in a different location. I didn't know that, thought that was interesting. So if you get casualties from 2 locations there, they may still be linked by that single event. The secondary injuries happen from projectiles. So these are things that have been thrown, and these are penetrating injuries from whatever happens to be around. And these can be very significant. Tertiary injuries, again, tend to result in blunt or penetrating trauma, patients being thrown against things. So this is where you see the head injuries and the pelvic fractures, etc. And then all the other quaternaries, the crush injuries, the burns, etc., etc. So, and if you forget all this stuff, then it's on the CDC website, and there's a really great app for that. What about the penetrating injuries from the gunshot wounds? Well, direct gunshot wounds it depends on the type of ammunition as to what kind of pattern that they result in. But again, worth knowing just following the trajectory of the bullet. But you also may get indirect injury from the shrapnel or the blast. And remember, there's always a potential for CBR contamination. Some of the improvised explosive devices have had nasty stuff stuck in them, and as well as all the ball bearings and other nasty things that they put in these kind of homemade bombs. And so we need to be aware of that in any incidents where we start receiving multiple casualties from one area. Cool, so if you forget this is the CDC website, and it's got there's an app for it too, which is very, very good. So let's talk about, before we go on and we're thinking about how we're going to receive our patients, let's look at where they got those guys who have done this very, very well. So let's look at Boston, April 15, 2013. Now, Boston is a great city for us to learn in because it's about the same size as Sydney, has the same number of trauma hospitals, and has quite a similar layout. So it's a really, really good corollary for us. So this is the Boston Marathon bombing. First IED, or improvised explosive device, was detonated at 14:49. The second went off about 13 seconds later, and they were only 200 metres apart, so they had a significant mass effect. There were lots of emergency services personnel already on scene because it was a public event. So that was absolutely life-saving. And so lots of bystander tourniquets were put on, and emergency services personnel got to get onto these patients very, very quickly. The other thing they did was feed it right up the food chain to the hospital as soon as possible so that they had very, very early warning that this bad thing had happened. And so, for example, the Brigham and Women's Hospital, which is one of the 5 main trauma centres, was notified 5 minutes after the event. Now, that is astounding. The Lindt Cafe Siege, we got 1 minute notice for the first, 3 minutes notice for the first casualty, who's a lady shot in the shoulder, and we got 1 minute notice for Katrina Bristow. 1 minute. Not that cool, hey? I got called exactly after that time, so 1 minute later, but this had all been going on for at least 1/4 of an hour prior. That makes an enormous amount of difference, that prep time. So at Boston, they immediately notified the hospital, activated the hospital disaster plan, because they have a system where they can autonomously actually push the button and get everything organised. They don't have to wait for it to go up the food chain and down the food chain like we do in New South Wales. 7 casualties arrived at once, and all those casualties arrived between 7 and 18 minutes post the event, most of them initially by private car, etc., etc. So if you look at the distribution of casualties around, within 18 minutes, all the casualties have been taken to different hospitals, and each hospital got about 30 casualties within the first hour or so. 264 patients between 5 hospitals. Pretty good effort, and they did really, really well. The reason that they did so well was that they trained for this. So I'll go back to this. So this is a recount from Atul Gawande, who's my absolute favourite author of all time, but this is from the New York Times, and it basically, as soon as they got all things almost organised, this torrent of casualties started coming through, and coming through much, much quicker than they had anticipated. This is the distribution of the casualties that they received, and you can see roughly 30 per major trauma centre. Okay, so back to our own event. All right, 12 minutes post. Right, giving you a few extra minutes just to get organised, yeah? All right, 3 casualties rock up to the ED in private vehicles and taxis. They're all bleeding heavily. Makeshift tourniquets have been applied. This is from the Opera House. One is very distressed and very disoriented, and this is the type of injury that you're seeing. Not so good, eh? All right, 14 to 18 minutes later, 22 casualties arrive, some by ambulance, some by private vehicle, again, some by taxi. Some are just brought in by their mates. Mixture. These are what they've got. You've got 13 gunshot wounds to the chest, abdo, and some of the limbs. You've got some blast injuries, which have a mixture of shrapnel-type injuries, but also some primary blast stuff. So quite serious injuries, lots and lots of red casualties, some orange, and very few green patients from this injury so far. So how many patients have we got in the ED right now? About 25. Okay? And they've all arrived within about 20 minutes. Pretty uncool. Okay, how are we going to triage these casualties? Well, this is really hard. You know, none of the triage tags and all those things have ever been really shown to work very well. We're supposed to use FirstNet, and we trialled that recently, and it wasn't too bad. And if it works, that's really, really great. But we need to set up a separate triage station outside, and we need to keep people organised. So in my centre now, we have some blue armbands to make sure that we can identify those people who are from the incident, so we don't lose them. And we've also we may institute a process where we take a photograph of people who've got any identifying details with them. So this is what the New Zealand police were trialling, and it actually worked quite well in terms of reconciliation. But triaging these casualties is going to be very, very tricky, and keeping track of who's going everywhere. So we're going to need good communication from those at the front door to those at the back, and then try feeding back as to who needs what and when very, very quickly. So all these patients need C, control of massive hemorrhage, airway, breathing, circulation. And it's not going to be full resus stuff. This is going to be very, very important but basic care. So we're going to keep air going in and out and blood going round and round. We're going to try not to intubate as many patients as they can because it takes up resources, and we're going to try and expedite all those people to theatre as quickly as possible, which means we need to change our mindset about normal business. We're not going to wait till they've had every tick box, piece of paper, rhubarb thing known to man before they go to the ward. They're going to get the basics, and they're going to get things documented quickly, and they're going to get it fed through to the receiving teams and get the heck out of there. And this is the mindset that's been very, very slow to change. It's quite difficult. So let's talk about Paris. Well, I had the pleasure to hang out with a guy called Eric Review, who was the head of the SAMU, or the ambulance for the northern part of Paris. And he was amazing to talk to, and he showed some very confronting footage at the ASM conference last year. There wasn't a single dry eye from any emergency physician in the room. It was very, very confronting. So 2015, this is what happened. Everybody remembers this. Coordinated terrorist attacks. At the Stade de France, the Bataclan, and there were cafes and restaurants in a similar area. Mixture of shootings and suicide bombers, 130 dead, 368 people injured, and there were about 100 people injured seriously. So that's a massive casualty load, isn't it? Huge casualty load. So this is what happened if you read through there. So 21:30 at the Stade de France, there were shootings and 3 explosions, and then the rest of the things went through. Now they have a different system in Paris for the SAMU, where they have physicians on most of the ambulances, and he showed some footage of the physicians being inside the Bataclan while there was still active shooting going on. And from a retrieval point of view, I was just like, can't believe they did that, but they saved some lives and they did an incredible job. My heart goes out to them, and my hat goes off to them. The thing that made Paris work is that they'd had word that there was going to be a shooting. The SAMU, particularly, and all the emergency services had trained for this in conjunction with the hospitals, so much so that they actually just done a training exercise that morning. So when the balloon went up, they all just thought it was another training exercise, and they just basically went to work. Amazing. So people were coordinated. They knew there was going to be a shooting after Charlie Hebdo. They had intelligence that was going to happen, so they were prepared for it. They activated the White Plan, which was a plan they came up with about 20 years ago and they thought they would never use. And it was about mobilising resources, opening up beds, getting the system to work and cope with this massive influx of really badly injured patients. The closest hospitals got up to 56 patients, but most hospitals, again, got about 30 patients. So this is the number that we should be working on. The first patients arrived in 7 minutes from the start of the incident. So 7 minutes and 30 patients seems to be consistent for all of these things, and this is what we need to work on in New South Wales. And I'm sure I'm known as a 7-minute 30 patient check in my hospital because I'm stamping my feet saying, nope, we have to think about this. This is, have a look at this blog this is Learning from the Paris Attacks. It's very confronting, and if you put yourself in this guy's shoes, wow, I think they did an incredible job. They started receiving casualties just 7 minutes after the attack, and this was the closest hospital, with no warning and no time to prepare. And the only thing that saved them was that they were already prepared because they had trained recently. All right, so again, distribution of who got what. We won't go on. And now let's have a little look back to our event. So we're now about 23 to 25 minutes post of our event, just to keep walking through our scenario here. So think about what worked in Boston, think about what worked in Paris. You get another 11 red casualties arriving by ambulance private vehicle. And they've again still got this mixture of blast injuries, some head injuries, some things that, unconscious people have been lying there for a while, took quite a while to get them into an ambulance and get them to you. And you've got some more patients presenting with both penetrating and blunt trauma. What are our next 3 priorities? When I put it to you that our next three priorities is to keep instituting CABC, treatment for all of these patients, and just keep clearing the ED, because we don't know when this is going to stop. And obviously, I'm going to give you 30 patients on a plate in this incident here, because that's what we're working on, 7 minutes and 30 patients. But we actually don't know if this is going to stop. And if this has the 4,000 patients going through town hall, well, you know what? We may be getting another onslaught and another onslaught. So again, this is where we need to change our mindset, and the mindset of our surgical colleagues in particular, that they can't wait till they've got a theatre available, or they've tied everything in a bow. They need to just stop the bleeding, ship them out, move on, and then the retrieval teams can take them off to more peripheral hospitals, which is what worked well in France. Hopefully we would have activated the disaster plan earlier, but the problem is that the disaster plan is actually very difficult to activate. So it has to go all the way up the food chain to the health, what we call the HAZFAC, and they have to get some communication from the site, and again, we may or may not get that information, and that has to trickle all the way back down again. Some of it's faxed communication, which in this day and age seems a little bit nuts, doesn't it? So it might take actually quite a long time for us to activate that disaster plan. And if we wait for that, then we're going to be well behind the eight ball and not able to take care of these patients well. So we actually need to be much more prepared than this. So last one, let's look at Orlando, June 2012, 2016. What happened there that worked for us? What can we learn from it? Well, 320 people in the Pulse nightclub at 2 a.m. Disgruntled employee decided he was going to take a semi-automatic weapon and a rifle and a pistol and then go bananas in this nightclub. So fireys were first on scene, and Orlando Regional Medical Centre was only a few minutes, about 2 blocks up the road. So 44 patients were taken up to the Orlando Medical Centre, which is only 3 blocks away. And only a few went to the Florida Hospital in Orlando. The shooting started at 2 a.m. 7 minutes was a time when they got their first casualties, and this torrent of patients came through in the next hour. Now, if you noted, interestingly, look at the times. So, 2:09, the casualties started to arrive in the hospital. If you look here, 3:29 was when the hospital page went out to say, come and help. In that time, the emergency department had already escalated, got their folks in. The surgeons had already been operating for an hour because they called in their mates and said, get in here now, and it took that long for the hospital to respond, and that's what we can learn from this, because that's what's going to happen and did happen in New South Wales. So we made our own plan the night of the siege. I'd been there all day, and a few of us who lived quite close to the hospital realised that things were going to go badly at between 2 and sort of 4 a.m, which is exactly what history has shown us with all these single shooter events. And so we all rang up and said, if anything happens, call us, and that's exactly what happened. There was no other formal plan. And, you know, a whole bunch of people having to be around and being passionate is not a plan. So what does 44 patients look like? Well, can I get you guys in the centre block to all stand up, please? Right, that's roughly what 44 patients looks like. Who here has just been in the ED in your terms? Yeah. How awful would it be to have 44 heavily bleeding patients needing care occurring in your department within an hour and not being able to provide the care that they need? Pretty horrible, eh? You can sit down. Thanks a lot. It's good to have a visual about the sheer volume of patients that you'll be getting. So the thing we want to do with this, and the reason I'm so passionate about this, we walked away from the siege going, you know, we could have done a better job than we did, but the system didn't allow us to do a better job than we did, and hopefully next time we will do better, because you know what, a mum of 3 died in my department. There was nothing we could have done to help her, and the coroner has definitely put that to rest. But the worst thing is knowing that you might be able to do a good job, but actually not having the facilities and the preparation and the mindset to do that. And that's what I'm really passionate about changing. And I'm going to hand the baton on to you guys to say, you know what, it's going to take your passion and your drive, because in your lifetime, it's very, very, as medical people, it's very likely that something will happen. You may well be involved in this. So what do we need to change? We need to change the mindset to CABC, so control of massive hemorrhage, ABC. And you guys are the ones who are going to be handed a whole bunch of tourniquets, given a 4-second lesson, and said, right, go and apply these to anyone who's bleeding. Mark the time on their forehead, so T equals time, and come and tell me which patients you've put them on. That's going to be your job. Hope you like it. We need to get get used to using sort of military things like tampons for penetrating wounds. Giving everybody TXA, thinking about things like hemostatic agents if there's a delay to theatre, and that's not in civilian practice, it's only in retrieval or military practice. And we need to get the idea of keeping those patients getting out of there. Damage control surgery, again, not something we do in civilian practice. And unless you have an army surgeon in your midst, again, it's going to be a foreign concept. Just fix the bleeding, leave the abdomen open, to send them to ICU, and we'll correct their temperature problem, their coagulopathy, and improve their physiology before they go back for the next lot of surgery. So again, it's a foreign concept for surgeons in most places. So 35, let's go back to our own disaster. 35 minutes post-event, you guys have now had 36 casualties in your ED, okay? You've got this many 18 gunshot wounds, 15 blast and penetrating wounds, and 3 patients with blunt trauma, which we're far more used to dealing. We now get told that the ambulance has set up a clearing post, 35 minutes post, and they reckon that they won't have moved any casualties for 45 minutes according to the AM plan. And as you can see now, this data I've drawn from all the other incidents, that's absolute rubbish as well. So we're going to be receiving patients not just by ambulance, but by other means way, way before that. And then we're going to keep getting more. So we need to think about our processes and get those patients out, but keep the care nice and simple. All right. So the things I want to give to you guys are, say yes to all the opportunities that come to you, because they may help you to deal with things like this. It's not if, it's when, and we've got to learn from those who've done it before, because if we don't, then we're kidding ourselves, and I think that's one thing we are doing very badly, and again, this is my opinion. There's plenty of people who heard me voice this opinion, but I think that it's really important that we learn from those who have done it well beforehand and take those things and go, teach me how to do it. Teach me how to save the lives when those things happen again. Communication is everything. We need to fix the barrier between communication outside the hospital and inside the hospital. We're still doing these ridiculous training exercises, which are great in themselves, but the pre-hospital guys are not talking to the inter-hospital guys. There was a disaster exercise you would have seen in the paper, one at Martin Place, one down at Barangaroo, done in the last 6 months. Were the hospitals involved in that? No, they weren't, because you can't disrupt normal operations of a hospital for a disaster exercise. Go figure. It's amazing what a disaster will do, isn't it? So we need to acknowledge that our current processes will be too slow, fix that, and we need to think about changing our mindset. And again, you guys will be the one who are going to take these forward. Those of you who are potential surgeons in the audience, you guys will need to go to be far more all over this as you go forward in your career. And psychological support. If you are ever involved in something like this, it is very, very important that you talk. My junior medical people on that night, I ran the department and while the siege was going on, while my colleagues looked after the Katrina and the Resus Bay and all the millions of police and everything else that was going on, as well as all the other casualties. I had 2 residents there who'd been there during the Christchurch earthquake, and then coming through this that night, it just stirred up all those things again. And obviously they did very, very well, and again, I was really pleased with the way that they actually toughened up and got through this. But you know what? They had to talk about it a lot afterwards, because not just going through one terrible incident and then being faced with another one is a very confronting thing, so very important. That you guys talk to your peers and your seniors to try and put things in perspective. And it's really nice for us to know that there actually isn't anything we could have done for Katrina and her family. But it's still pretty confronting when our father is there putting his head in his hands saying, how do I tell my 3 kids that mum's not coming home? That's really awful. And you know what? I want to walk away from the next one going, we may not have done a perfect job, but damn it, we did the best possible job we could, and we sent as many parents home to their families, etc., and the kids home to their families as intact as we possibly could. So I could definitely say that there were no opera houses or rock stars were harmed in this, making it this fictitious disaster. I can tell you that all the numbers taken from there were from the evidence that's out there from these disasters, and I can tell you that it's not if, it's when. And that's not from any internal intelligence, it's just stuff that's out there in the media, etc. now, and we need to be prepared. So if you guys are involved in anything like this, please come and help us. You guys will be pushing trolleys, you guys will be putting tourniquets on, but please talk afterwards, because it's very important that we all learn from this and we all make sure that you're fit to do the next one. Cool. Any questions? Thank you. That's on. Yeah.
We have a seat over there, and we have some questions come through the app.
Haven't had a couch before, exciting.
Okay, so one of the questions is being an emergency physician a sustainable job? And do you have other plans for your future, or do you think this is what you'll stick with?
Great question. I was talking about it with my colleague over the weekend. I think yes and no. I think most emergency physicians are only doing it half-time, because I think the system is, you guys would have read a lot about this sort of system changes recently. I think it can grind you down, but resuscitating patients I'm still very passionate about. I love spending all day in the resus bay, so I think I will spend quite a long time doing it. I'd like to go explore some disaster stuff and explore maybe some clinical leadership stuff with some more training a little bit later, but if I don't ever want to stop resuscitating patients, because that's really fun.
All right. How do you feel after working a mass casualty event, and how do you process those emotions?
That is, again, a great question. I was furious, like gobsbittingly angry for that first year afterwards, if I'm completely honest now. And I think there are 2 ways you can approach it. I think if you come away, we do lots of multiple casualty accidents in pre-hospital land. But we set up and we actually walk away most of the time going, you know what, actually we did as good a job as we possibly could with the resources that we had. And that's okay, you can process that, because that's all anyone's ever going to ask of you. It's never going to be perfect. But it's when you know that you could do a better job, but the system was broken so that it didn't allow you to do as good a job as you might. That's when it becomes really difficult. And how do you process it? Well, you put your high heels on and you stamp your feet and you go, let's change this until it works next time. That's what you do.
Okay, so there has been a lot of talk in the media about what can be done to prevent terrorist events. what is your opinion on prevention tactics?
You know what, I'm probably not qualified to answer that question. The briefing from the tactical police gave me a completely different perspective, and I honestly say I don't think I'm qualified to answer that. It's so complex, I think.
Yeah. If you were to go back in time and do anything differently, would you?
No. Again, talking about that with a colleague over the weekend, no. And I think that's what's really nice to be able to convey to you guys is that, you know, there were times when I was really lost and just thinking, well, what the hell am I doing? And is what I'm doing now really going to get me to where I want to go? And the answer is yes, and it's made it easier or better or allowed me to go, yeah, I've done that before. Yeah, I can do that. And rather than going, oh, I've never had an experience because all I've done is go along the road. So no, I actually wouldn't do anything differently, I think. Yeah.
I think that's all the time.
If that's okay.
Question? Yeah.
Is it on? These sorts of terrorist attacks and this is so strange. Mass casualty things have been happening for a while. Why is it that, NSW sort of health, but everywhere else, why are they so slow to catch up with changing? Because, people like hospitals around the world have these systems in place and healthcare networks have these systems in place. Why are we so slow to do that in Sydney, which is, if anything's going to happen, it's probably going to be here? Why are you having to fight so hard to change this?
Again, fabulous question. The answer, I think the truthful answer is, and again, this is my opinion only, so from wading through all the stuff that we've been wading through since the Lindt Cafe exercise, two things. Nobody's got any experience. We're not listening to those who've had experience and we're trying to reinvent the wheel ourselves. No one's actually dedicated to doing this stuff, so people are doing this in a bit of their non-clinical time or a bit of this, and it's kind of down the bottom all the time because it's not in your face, whereas, having 75 patients in the ED and 30 patients access block is always in our face, whereas this stuff is something we'll do a bit later and something we'll do a little bit later. And then the policy makers and the decision makers have no real world experience, just none. And they're being fed information by people who also have no real world experience. So rather than going finding that experience is really, that's the thing I find most frustrating. And like I said, I was lucky to do some of this stuff with the Defence Force, and we often ran casualties where we had 15 or 30 casualties, and they had some really good systems, and they were also taught by some of my CareFlight colleagues who have probably the most civilian disaster experience in Australia, and so we did lots of learnings from that. So that's when we learnt that the triage tags are a waste of time, and that's when we learnt that having your resources centralised, for example, down the middle of the room, and being able to respond from either side and deploying your staff that way, those are the things that worked. And they're little things, but when you write them into a policy, that's what creates the flow that makes these things happen. So I think we just need to listen more and learn more and actually just confront the fact that this is going to happen. Everybody put your cards on the table and stop doing what we think is going to happen and listen to what has happened in the past and learn from that. That would be my opinion only, so it comes with a big disclaimer, but that's what I think.
We have another question.
Cool.
Thank you so much for this presentation. It's been incredible. My question, two parts. In your experience, you mentioned adopting a damage control strategy. In what scenarios, injury patterns, patient loads, do you think we should be adopting the shift between the detailed surgery approach versus damage control? And also, in terms of training for these scenarios, what training approaches and strategies have you found have created the best outcomes?
So, again, excellent question. So my thinking is that we need to switch to that damage control mindset from the first time we get the notification. And if it turns out that we don't have to and we can take these patients back to theatre later in our own hospitals to tidy things up, well, that's great. But if the moment we start to get these torrents of casualties coming in at the 7-minute mark, I think that's when we switch into damage control mode. It basically will be when the numbers of patients requiring surgery, and bear in mind, tourniquets can only stay on for about 90 minutes as the standard. No one really knows, but that's the current sort of standard. So you've got to get all those patients with tourniquets to theatre to fix the bleeding, and then we can resuscitate them properly. within 90 minutes, and that's a massive load if you look at all those patients who went to theatre beforehand. So I think the technical answer is when your ability to operate properly on all those people exceeds your resources, but obviously that's going to be like a boiling frog, isn't it? It's going to be, so I think you have to, my feeling is you need to plan for that and flick the switch when the first lot of casualties start rolling in the door, because you don't know how many more are coming and you don't know in what time frame, so I think that's when you need to do that. In terms of training, certainly multi-agency training, getting left hand to talk to right hand, and it was really interesting when we briefed with the tactical police a year later after the Lindt Cafe thing. It gave us a whole new understanding about their processes and why it seems so obvious looking back, why we didn't get the information that we needed for the health plan to activate, because they didn't want to say anything over any form of communication because it was supposed to be a terrorist incident until about 2:30 that afternoon. So, but there was never de-escalated into a single shooter. So it was, these just communication processes need to be fixed. And I think that is our number one priority, to get that done, both out of the hospital, between the hospitals, and getting that moving. So I think that's where we should concentrate our efforts, and then just changing our mindsets from this is going to be a busy day at the office to let's set everything up, we're doing the needful only and move on, which is a different mindset. Does that sort of answer your question? Yeah.
Sorry, just a quick question. So in your fictitious scenario, you keep talking about like we should get to this 7-minute mark.
Yes.
What do you think it would be at the moment, say to RPA or RNS or Vinnies? What would we be looking at?
I think 7 minutes would be the same. I think we would be lucky if we if we got no casualties before 7 minutes. We're really, the light rail corridor has interrupted things a little bit, but because we ended up, it was interesting, I think there's still some confusion over this, but the casualties from the siege, some were supposed to go to Vinnies, which actually had a team on standby ready to go, and we got it because we're straight up George Street, so geographically we were the easiest one to find. So if it happens, it depends where it happens. If it happens in Parramatta, obviously it's going to be Westmead, and some will be taken to Liverpool, etc. But if it happens in the central city, it's going to be a very short transit time, and people will Uber, public transport, do whatever they can to get there, and it's quick. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no worries.
I think that wraps up question time, and thank you very much for your time and your talk.
Cool. Thank you very much. Thanks, guys. Have fun.
Thank you.